All right, welcome back. We're going to talk about the ethics of belief, and we're going to focus on Clifford's Evidentialism today. There's going to be further videos next week on William James, and then we'll be done with this topic. Okay, here's the basic question. We've moved on from God, and the new question that we're going to focus on for this week and next week is, what should I base my beliefs on? What's an appropriate basis for forming beliefs? And by beliefs, we're going to include, some of you brought this up, what sometimes colloquially we refer to as opinions. Those count as beliefs for our purposes. Anything that if somebody asked you, do you think that blank, and you said yes, that's a belief. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. What should I base my beliefs on? And what shouldn't I base my beliefs on? And by basing my beliefs, here's some sort of candidate answers for the sort of things that you might in fact base your beliefs on, or you might consider as appropriate or inappropriate bases for belief. Desire, for example. Should I believe what I want to believe? Should I believe something if I desperately want it to be true? Or is that not an appropriate basis for belief? Should I believe something if someone tells me, if someone gives me testimony? Does it depend on the reliability of the testifier? What if I don't know their reliability? Are people entitled to a default presumption to truth-telling? Or should I just be skeptical of everything anyone tells me unless and until that I've been given independent evidence that what they say is true? Can I ever believe on the basis of faith, where faith is something like trust, or specifically like a theological trust, a trust in the person of God? Is that ever an appropriate basis for belief? Is it an appropriate basis for belief only in religious domains, or might faith be relevant outside of religious domains? What about my values, right? If I was raised to really value courtesy, is it appropriate for me to believe that everyone should be courteous in a particular way on the basis just of the fact that I was raised to have that value? Or maybe to take a more plausible example, if I value, say, human life, if I think that that is a basic, absolute, inviolable a value in the world, is that all by itself a good reason for me to form beliefs about, say, abortion, capital punishment, social matters? And then finally, what about evidence, right? Should we only believe things we have evidence for? Is it ever appropriate to believe without evidence? And what counts as evidence anyway? So there are a lot of things we might mean by evidence, including some of the things above. So, does testimony itself count as evidence? Can it? Does direct perception count as evidence? When I look outside in my yard, I have like a visual experience of a tree. Is that evidence that there's a tree? Seems like it. What about scientific observation? What kinds of observations count as evidence? Does it have to be embedded in a theory, or just a sort of smattering of microscope observations? Are those evidence? What about reason and argumentation? Philosophical evidence, so to speak, which we've been using so far in this class. Intuition. Your intuitions about cases like the bully case. Is that evidence? So perhaps all or none of those. Those are the kinds of questions that we get into in the ethics of belief. What is an appropriate basis for belief? And if our answer is something like evidence, what is evidence anyway? Clifford has a simple and powerful answer to the question of what is a good, right, or appropriate basis for belief. His answer is known as Clifford's rule, also sometimes referred to as evidentialism. It is always wrong everywhere for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. Notice that this is all by itself not a complete answer, because the question is, what is an appropriate or inappropriate basis for belief? Clifford's rule all by itself just tells us what is an inappropriate basis for belief. He says it's always wrong to believe without sufficient evidence. But we probably also should want out of a theory of the ethics of belief like a positive answer, like, okay, great, I shouldn't believe anything without sufficient evidence. Does that mean, presumably, that I should believe anything I have sufficient evidence for? So Clifford doesn't say so explicitly, but I think it's pretty plausible to read that into the text. And we could formulate this sort of other half, the positive version of Clifford's rule. So if Clifford's rule is the prohibitive, don't do this, we could pretty easily come up with the prescriptive, the do this. And the do this, which we can call Clifford's other rule, is one should believe whatever one has sufficient evidence for. Think of evidentialism as the conjunction of Clifford's rule and Clifford's other rule. Or take together the claim that you should never believe anything on the basis of insufficient evidence, and that you should always believe everything you have sufficient evidence for. Put those two claims together, the positive and the negative, and what you get is the appropriate basis for belief, or the norm, the rule of belief, is evidence. And that's evidentialism. We're going to focus on Clifford's rule, the negative half, but do sort of keep in the back of your mind that the stronger thesis, evidentialism, is important, and that maybe there's a little gap there. We're going to sort of just suppose that Clifford's rule, the negative part, and evidentialism, for the sake of argument, go hand in hand. So here's the conclusion, right? So Clifford has this bold claim, like, never believe anything on the basis of insufficient evidence. Why think that, right? This is philosophy class, and we're looking for arguments. What is his argument? So let's take CR3 to just be Clifford's rule, and let's make that the conclusion of an argument and search for the premises. Well, his first premise is this: it is always wrong to believe anything that is socially significant, or it's always wrong to hold any socially significant belief upon insufficient evidence. Together with CR2, the second premise, every belief held by anyone is socially significant. So the first premise just tells us that if your belief is socially significant, by which we can mean capable of doing of impacting the welfare of others positively or negatively, if that's the sort of belief you have, then you better have sufficient evidence. And if you don't, then it's wrong for you to believe what you believe, because you could hurt other people. The second premise comes in and says every single belief is socially significant. None are sort of isolated and private and have no implications for others. So let's focus on the first premise. What is his defense? It's the ship owner case. Pretty simple. The ship owner doesn't do his due diligence. We talked about the details in class, so I'm not going to go through all of it. Doesn't do his due diligence and forms the belief that the ship is seaworthy, contrary to the evidence that he's collected that it's not. Sends the travelers out on his ship across the Atlantic. In version 1, the ship is not seaworthy and it sinks and they die. Version 2 is exactly the same. The ship owner believes that it's seaworthy when it's not, but by a stroke of luck, miraculously, the ship makes it across and no one dies and it's all okay. In both cases, Clifford says, point 1, the ship owner's belief, his belief about whether or not the ship was seaworthy, is a socially significant belief. Clearly in version 1, it caused the death of a bunch of people. Version 2, he just got lucky. It certainly could very easily have caused death. Second point is, according to Clifford, and he expects you to share his intuition here, the ship owner's believing as he did on the basis he did was wrong. Morally, it was wrong. Why was it wrong? It's not just because the belief turned out to be false, because in version 2, the belief was true. The ship made it across. But still, he says, we still judge him to have done something wrong in that case. So it can't be the truth or falsity of the belief that explains why his believing as he did was wrong. It's also not the actual bad consequences, because in version 2 there were no actual bad consequences. Nor is it how he acted, although Clifford is going to say the action is a separate wrongdoing as well, but it's a separate one. The believing all by itself, even if it hadn't followed an action, would have been wrong. The only explanation of what it is about that belief that was wrong is that it was formed on the basis of insufficient evidence. It's not the content, the truth, really not even the believing itself, but it was the how was that belief formed. He didn't do his due diligence in terms of collecting and attending to the evidence. He based his belief on insufficient evidence. It was a belief that could have hurt other people. In version 1 it did. In version 2 he got lucky, but that doesn't matter. And it was wrong. Clifford says, if you buy that as the explanation of what went wrong in the shipowner case, it's not just an accidental feature of that one imaginary case. It's because in general, it's always wrong everywhere for anyone to hold any socially significant belief on insufficient evidence. Come up with any other case of a belief that's really socially significant and that's held on the basis of insufficient evidence, and he expects you'll have an intuition, just like you did in the shipowner case, that that's an irresponsible, bad, wrong way of believing with that kind of belief that could impact others. His second claim is that every belief held by anyone is socially significant, right? He puts it this way, something like, no belief is private and isolated. No belief is insignificant. Okay, so I'm not going to give the full numbered premise version of the defense here, but I'm just going to sort of lay out an informal version of what it is that Clifford is up to when he says that every belief is socially significant, and try to compress it a little bit because he goes on for pages and pages. Here's his thought. Just as we have habits of acting, right? Sometimes bad habits, sometimes good habits. Habit of nail biting. Just as you, every time you bite your nails, you a little bit reinforce the habit, make it more likely you'll do it again in the future. Likewise, there are habits of belief formation. And these are habits of what bases we use to form our beliefs. Every time you believe based on an unsourced rumor on the internet, makes it more likely that you'll trust an unsourced rumor again in the future. That's his first thought. We can call this a habit of belief formation. His first claim here is that there is a habit, an individual habit of believing on insufficient evidence. That every time an individual believes on the basis of insufficient evidence, they're enforcing in themselves the habit of believing on insufficient evidence. And we can distinguish between like an individual habit, which is just a matter of how it is that you tend to form your beliefs, and then a like collective society-wide habit of how it is that all of us as a community, as a university, as a country, whatever level of decomposition you want to be talking about, how do we collectively form our habits, our beliefs? And the second step is that there's a kind of transmission that occurs between individuals, that the sort of social collective of what it is that we all together, what habits we have about belief formation, those are a product causally and like conceptually of the individual belief forming habits that each of. The third point is that the more widespread a particular habit becomes among individuals, the greater the social force of that habit is as a whole, and therefore the more likely it is that as a society we will collectively be disposed to believe things on insufficient evidence, and that courts disaster is the idea. So it may be that in any individual case, right, like what you believe about, some rumor you read online that you don't have evidence for is harmless, you might think, for yourself. It's kind of private. But Clifford's point is that you are reinforcing a habit in yourself, and the way in which human beings gain their habits are from others. You, in virtue of that individual belief, are making up a whole of a community of believers, not religious believers necessarily, but people who believe things. And the more people believe on the basis of insufficient evidence, the more likely it is that there will be bad consequences. The more people doubt that COVID-19 is real, for example, the more likely it is that there will be more spread of COVID-19 due to carelessness that resulted from individual beliefs. And like, this is Clifford's point. There is no private belief, and belief really matters. You put those two together, and he says this is why evidence must be the norm of belief. We're going to, next week, pick up with William James, who takes issue with Clifford's sweeping claim. He agrees with Clifford, like, in some areas, but he says sometimes the evidence just doesn't settle things one way or the other. And to pretend otherwise is actually dangerous. To pretend that evidence can settle things can actually risk, in some areas of life, missing out on great goods. In those areas, William James says, it is appropriate and good for you to believe without sufficient evidence. So we'll pick up there on Monday.